I now have with me downtown businessman Denis Navratil. There is a certain sequence that occurs when somebody wants to start up a business that we want to look at today. And the process is basically this. Someone wants to bring a new business into an area. Well, before that can be done, approval must be obtained from people already living in the area. Have I got that right? That's generally the process.
Yep.
And we're looking at a situation here of property rights, of the property rights involved with that particular type of activity.
Yeah.
Dennis,
well, George, I recently read an editorial in the Journal Times discussing property rights, and it was sort of a, they were trying to find a balance between local and state. There's issues concerning local versus state dominance over the issue of property rights. And there was a very curious view of property rights exemplified by this paragraph. So I want to read this. It was a classic example of local control and an exercise of private property rights. Quote, I own property here and I don't want this in my neighborhood. All right.
That's very, in other words, what it is a businessman came in, wanted to start up a business. The people that already own property rights says, I have property rights here, I don't want this in my neighborhood, and they're saying, it's my right to tell you, you can't start this up.
The assertion is, because I own property, I can have a say over the use of other people's property.
Exactly.
That's a curious interpretation. That's not how I understand property rights. Is that because I own property, I can therefore tell my neighbor what he or she cannot do with theirs.
And this gets into a very interesting question, and you and I, as libertarians, understand this, where many other ideologies don't. And I'm going to describe it this way. It's called the thing called collective rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that's typically what the individual who wants to block the other individual for exercising his rights is doing it from a collectivist viewpoint. That's the way I look at it. It's the old adage that you hear from libertarians that taxation is theft. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense to some people, but the person that understands individual rights, it does. Because I can't take money from you. I can't just come and say, I'm taking money from you. Right. But if we get enough people and we form a government, then collectively we can take money from you and call it taxation.
It's
right?
interesting.
That's how collective rights work as opposed to individual rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the fictitious person that's making this quote about property rights is doing exactly that. They are asserting the right not just themselves, but to gather people together and decide what you can do with your property. And in a way, it's interesting that you brought up the monetary end of things, George, because they are taking part of your property, what you can do with it, and therefore would have a financial impact on you. If, for example, you're not allowed to do anything with your property, that could really hurt you financially.
A tremendous impact on it, and that's occurred in many parts of the United States, particularly people that get onto lands that later become natural forest or wetland or something like that, and they all of a sudden they find out they can't do anything with their property. They have this nice property, they've wanted to build kind of a place to get away from out in some wilderness, and then they find out they can't do anything with it because of the collective nature of that particular property. The collective has more power over that piece of property than the individual who owns it.
Yeah. If I could get back to this article for a second, the debate that the Journal Times is weighing in on is which collective gets to determine your rights. In other words, is it best to have the local government lord over you or the state government? In this case, it is the state trying to override the local government to ensure your property rights, which the Journal Times...
We got a minute here. Let's get down to the specifics. What is it in a town, village, or city government wants to open a piece of its land, a particular business activity, it relies on the consent of the governed. We saw it here recently in Caledonia when a developer wanted to build a Walmart. Residents of the proposed location voiced their strenuous objections, and in both instances, the village board yielded to the will of the people.
Right.
That's very interesting. They yielded to the will of the people. Well, what about the will of the owner of that property?
Right.
What
So
happens with
the
that?
Journal Times is saying that property rights is when those people gather together and decide that the person who owns the property that wants to build Walmart essentially has no property rights. And this article, there's someone from the state. There's someone from the state who's wanting to override that local
control.
what they call property rights. I would call mob rights, and ensure property rights for the individual. It is an individual. Getting back to whether this is an individual right or not, it ought to be framed that way. Not that an individual can do anything that he or she wants with their property, but it should be framed at least as an individual right, not as a group right.
That is very true. And for instance, we all have the right to own a gun. A basic right. As individuals, we understand that. Let's put it that way. As a libertarian looking at individual rights, we have the right to own a gun, unfettered. But at the same time, we can't take that gun out and shoot somebody with it just because we feel like it. Because now we're infringing on their property rights to actually have a body that functions. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
In other words, you've got the right to. So where does the barrier actually come about? And I maintain it comes about when you have an actual physical interference with the other person's activity in the use of their property. In other words, you can't steal from them, you can't take money from them, you can't shoot them, you can't shoot holes in their building, you can't go smash down their doors just because you have a right to own a hammer. But at the same time, for that other person to say, well, you can't own a hammer because you might bang down my door, you see, that's where we've gotten to the point of collective rights interfering unwarrantedly into individual rights. It's a tough barrier, and it's an area that we have to straighten out as a society if we're ever going to become free again. The whole concept of freedom from, which started with Woodrow Wilson, freedom from fear, that type of concept led into a perversion of the notion of freedom.
George, I'm going to switch.
Go ahead.
I like what you said. I want to switch gears because you made me think of something. You talked about gun rights. Imagine if I assert I have a gun right, you have a gun right. The way they're describing this property right is you and I could get together and say that someone in the audience, can't have a gun because we're asserting our gun rights to stop him from having a gun. That's a strange formulation of a gun right. And it's also a strange formulation of a property right if you and I as property owners can prevent someone else to use their property, to assert their right.
That's exactly right. I agree with that. And somehow we've got to learn this as a society if we want to become, once again, go back to this state of freedom we once enjoyed in this country. All right, we're going to take a break here, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about this concept of collectivism versus personal property rights.